research seminars. Sorry they started up a bit late in the academic year, but there will be more of these after Christmas and the New Year, indeed for the next term. That's what I'm talking about. But it's fantastic that we can begin with work one of our own. Because, for those who don't know him, Sam is not only part of the Brunel Arts, where he teaches guitar, and also teaches very useful theory class, which not enough people go to, but he also has been a PhD student here as a composer for a number of years, and will have his viva voce examination in the new year.
22nd of January,
Will go extremely well. I think it's safe to predict. Because Sam's work is really interesting, and what he's going to talk about mostly is this CD. It's a very beautiful CD. I mean, I say this
because that's your name.
That name there. But the record is very beautiful, and well, it ignores the fact that it's been very beautifully engineered and produced by someone else in this room. But Sam, I mean, the thing that makes Sam interesting, John. The thing that makes Sam interesting is that there are lots of composers who imagine that they are really interesting performers, but there are very few composers who are actually astonishing performers. And my introduction to Sam was initially as someone who had studied at the Royal College of Music.
Well,
and then gone on to Southampton Music Department, University Music Department, to do a degree which he completed with as successfully as one can complete an undergraduate degree, and also won a major composition prize at Southampton. And then a few years later decided to start doing a PhD, so I got to know him initially as a composer. And there was talk, I mean, he would turn up sometimes with a guitar, and I would think, well, here's a composer with a guitar, no surprise there. And then I gradually got to hear him as a guitarist, and I realised what a formidable performer he is. My experience, which I think we'll come back to in the course of this seminar, as a composer who's having a piece played by Sam, is that it's one of those really astonishing experiences that one can have as a composer. And this is a piece that I wrote many years ago. Sam sort of brought it back to life, and every time I've heard him play, which I think I've heard him play 2 or 3 times, maybe 4 times in concert, and the wonderful thing that he does, and that really great performers do, is that every time he plays it, he brings something new. There's a new detail, there's something else, something has changed, and that's what I think truly great performers do. And he just plays formidably well. That's 2 formidables. Sam, speak.
Well, that's quite an introduction to live up to. Sometimes you do these things and people say that cliched phrase, he's operating at the height of his powers, and it makes you feel like a microwave or something, and you have to sort of, do an hour on 800 watts or whatever. But anyway, so I shall now do my best impression for an hour and, maybe an hour and a bit, and then we'll do some types of questions, to be formidable in some way, or at the very least to say something interesting. About this project, this project of what I call Refracted Resonance, which is the name of this CD. And really, I think that this talk, whenever I do these sort of lecture recitals or seminars or whatever, this is basically performance sort of masquerading as research in some way. And so I'm here as a practitioner. I have to sit and with a score and there's a composer somewhere, and I have to work out what I want to do, and then try and convince them that that's a good thing to do. And so I'm really here to speak as a practitioner of contemporary music, as a sort of living art form, and not really as an academic expert in a wider sense. So I'm going to commit that sin of academia quite a lot today, and I'm going to use autobiography as analysis. I'm going to extrapolate meaningful things from some autobiographical moments in my life that have led to the creation of this. And Refracted Resonance, really, I suppose, is, you could spin it down to 4 things. One is that it's basically, you can't see it all, it's basically a study of the resonance that the guitar can create in all its various wonderful guises, and alongside that, some of my obsessions, which is how we can have things that are virtuosic but in different kinds of ways. Sometimes I think we have I'll say a bit more about what I mean by that when we see each piece, but I think sometimes we can have a slightly one-dimensional view of virtuosity. If you read a review of a concert or something, and the critic, speaks about virtuosity, most of the time what they're really speaking about is fast fingers. And that's something that, that's one kind of virtuosity, but it's certainly not the only kind of way that one can be virtuous. But that one can play in an extremely dexterous way. There are other kinds of virtuosity that I'm interested in. The guitar, as you know, has a checkered history to do with tuning. It's quite an interesting story in a way, because it splits away from most of the bowed string family in that the basic tuning unit is the fourth and not the fifth. And the first piece of music that says on the top, for guitar, was composed in 1546 by Alonso Murara, and before that, guitar, what's called guitar, vihuela, some Baroque guitar instruments, some lutes, were basically interchangeable in what they could play. They had similar range, similar tuning schemes, and essentially you could have plucked string music, but not necessarily guitar music. And he sort of changed all that and wrote at the top, this must be played on what was the modern guitar at the time, and that sort of settled the tuning. What was called the modern tuning, which is the one we have now, fourths and one major third. But there are lots of other interesting tunings that composers have experimented with and you can come up with, and that's something that has underpinned a lot of my work with different composers, although not with Christopher, yet. We didn't do anything to the tuning yet. Although, actually, when we come back to your piece, we'll see that I think you have done something interesting to the tuning, even without changing it. But anyway, I can say something about that later. And then the last one at the bottom is maybe linked to the tuning in a way, certainly in some of the pieces, is my obsession with the harmonic series, the natural series of overtones, which is something that the guitar is extraordinarily good at, and when combined with the naturally decaying resonance of the guitar, it's something that really, how can I say, gets me going. Gets me up in the morning, you have to have something that keeps you sitting on the damn chair in front of the music stand, practicing all the time. And that's one of the things I think that really does it. I should also mention that that's not a completely innocent love of the Overtone series and decaying resonance. I'm also obsessed with bells, and my PhD research in composition focuses a lot on how the relationship between the technical and theoretical aspects of bell, tuning, spectra, and concert music, particularly church bells. And so bell-like sounds are something that I've always been interested in, I would say, I think I could say obsessed with. And so this story really starts, I suppose, with a very long collaboration between me and George Holloway, English composer George Holloway, who now lives in Taiwan, and he came here last year to give a talk about composing music for professionals and amateurs in China. He was Dean of Composition at the Tianjin Conservatory, and now he lives in Taiwan, and he teaches at a university there now. He approached me at a concert in Southampton in 2007. I played Britain's Nocturnal. Britain's Nocturnal? It's a theme of variations on Dowland. It starts with this very beautiful little thing, and at the end you get this beautiful... the Dowland theme, and it starts with the variations and you work on the theme. Anyway, George was an usher in that concert, and afterwards he said, I really like your concert. I want to write you a piece. He was doing his PhD at the time in composition, and he said, can I write you a piece? And so I said, absolutely. He said, what do you want me to write? And I said, I think, and I was obsessed in those days with, this was maybe the first kind of virtuosity, was purely physical things, and I said, I want you to write something you can write anything you like, and I want you to assume that I can do anything physically, and then I'll find a way. I'll find a way to do it. And so George went away and thought about this, and he came back a little while later with some sketches of chords with ridiculous stretches, and I came up with this amazing tuning and whatever. And he said, this was really hard. And I said, why? What's the problem? And he said, well, you've given me too much freedom. He said, you've given me too much And so I had to impose some strictures on what I'm going to do. And he said that I'm only going to do things that are hard, that's the first thing, so I'm only going to look for materials that are actually difficult to play in some way. And I'm also latching on to this idea of two Lithuanian people who were prominent in the Soviet resistance, two poets, or a poet and one of their students. These political dissidents were captured and put in prison, and then they self-immolated. They went on hunger strike and they killed themselves in the revolution. And the original, George never likes me telling this story, but the original subtitle, he called it Sonata for Guitar, this big sort of title. But the original subtitle was A Joyful Song Sung Through Prison Bars. And that was a good key for me, a good clue of how to get in to the thing. Because it gave this idea of some sort of extremely difficult, hard-won freedom, found through restriction. And so basically he limited himself to two materials, which I'm going to demonstrate. Now, if I go this way, you should get, yes, the score. And it took him a long time to write this. That says 2009 to 10, but it was actually 2009 to 11, really, by the time he'd been through and fiddled about with everything. And he restricts himself to two kinds of material. One that's constructed almost entirely in natural harmonics, and one that's constructed almost entirely in normal fretted notes, with varying kinds of textures around those two things. And the range of technical resources is enormous and very, very inventive. When you consider that George can't play the guitar really at all, he worked all this stuff out in his head. And so when I play you some of these examples, hopefully you'll be able to understand what kinds of intellectual feat he performed to come up with these two things. I should say that, first of all, that he, at the time, had an interest in sort of pseudo-spectral music, and I've had a huge interest in spectralism, for a very long time. And so I think the first thing I should say is about the tuning that he defined, which is written out here at the bottom. And I'm going to I'll show you how to get into it, because it's quite an interesting thing for later to know something about this. So the tuning scheme that he says, this is in standard tuning at the moment, he got E, B flat, 1/3 flat. So anyway, we'll say more about that in a minute. And then D as normal, G as normal, C quarter tone sharp, and E as normal. So the first thing that I suppose I had to do when given this piece was to work out how to get into this tuning and sort of start to understand it. And I realised, or maybe he told me, I'm trying to make myself sound good, we worked out together on the way that he'd come up with this tuning, was that the low E is the fundamental of this piece. And so what he's doing is trying to define overtones, or harmonies based on overtones, from that low E. And so if I go, now this is how to get the B 1/3 flat, B flat 1/3 flat. If I go up the harmonic spectrum of E, you hit the seventh, that's the seventh partial, the seventh overtone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And it's a D, but it's flat a bit by nature. In fact, I can tell you it's exactly 31% flat. If you divide a semitone into 100 equal parts, called cents, like cents in a dollar. And so that is exactly 31 cents flat of equal tone, like you find on the piano. If I play normal, there's a D. The difference, the spectral difference is very beautiful. And so what he does is he defines this is a bit weird, the fifth partial of that one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. To be the same as each other. So in that way, that gets me, the open string now is B flat 1/3 flat, because essentially that overtone on the fifth string, on the normal A string, is 14% flat, and then you add the 31 to that, and you end up with the right amount away from B flat as an open string. And so some of the tuning schemes that have been come up with for these pieces that I've been working on with these composers are to do with exactly that, and making comparisons between the overtone series of open strings. And from that we can define what the basic thing is. Then it's normal, and that's the C quarter tone sharp, halfway between C and C sharp. And so I just But at the start, you know, electric tune or whatever. And so, on the basis of that tuning, you think, well, what can you possibly find? Well, if I show you the first one, here's the first material, which is constructed in harmonics. And I suppose the thing to note here is that George writes at sounding pitch. Quite often in guitar scores, you write where you touch the string. But he writes at sounding pitch, and then above sometimes makes a note of where you can find these harmonics. And so one of the first things that I did was make a chart here of where lots of the common overtones are. I made a little chart of where they go. It was my preference to have it written this way because I wanted to be able to see what actually the sound, what sounding pitches were going to be. But it took a little while to get into reading in this way because it doesn't show you where you touch; it just shows you what you make. So you have to know, where things are. Anyway, I'll play a little bit of this opening material. That's the opening material of this piece, and it makes a really strong impression. And what you can really hear is how it emanates not from E. This is something I'm obsessed with the guitar. Historically, you get a big chord in some guitar music, and it's E on the bottom. It's stuck all the time. Like that's the lowest note on the piano or something. And it's always banging on this E. And I don't know whether you noticed, but he really carefully defined this opening material that it starts on equally tempered D, and microtonal rub of that partially defined to make the tuning against a normal D. It's an incredibly powerful opening statement. Did you notice the E creeping in later on, but then in the higher register, and across the piece here descends that E through the registers of the guitar until you get at the end the fundamental of the whole piece. And the second material, some of these fretted notes, is also very bold but smoother and more. Smoother is probably the best word for it. It has a sort of undulating feel. I'll just play a little bit of this second material that comes immediately. His sort of formal model was Barraquet's piano sonata, which has these two very clearly delineated materials and juxtaposed one against the other. And eventually they do some sort of synthesis. What's the Cohn, isn't it? Have you read this Cohn article about Stravinsky, Stratification, Interlock and Synthesis? That's a good one. It's about materials doing this sort of thing. Anyway, I'll play a little bit the second material. Flavour of the second material. It has this sort of really, what he says, quite smooth and slightly floating sort of feel with these very dexterous spreading motifs. This is something that George picked up on a lot in his piece. He loved that. And he wrote in his PhD that he specifically tried to target this finger dragging. In Baroque composition, this... Of course, now I'm in a funny tune too. He used to decorate chords in really important cadential points. These sort of decorative things that you would just do off the top of your head. He tried to write them out, and if I show you some here, if we go through to this section here, where it's wild and jagged. He writes some of these things in that really dragging across the strings with consecutive fingers. And it's so he really builds a fantastic texture out of that, which is something that we only usually hear, you know, maybe at some conventional point when someone's trying to be decorative. But takes the decorative and makes something structurally functional out of it, which I think is quite amazing. I just want to show you some of the notational things that we came up with for this piece, like writing on two staves, which is basically not done in guitar music, you know, I would write on one stave, but there was just too much stuff to fit. So in this stave, in this one, what happens at the bottom of the little stave is the left hand alone performing some tremolo, and the right hand plays some artificial harmonics, you know, harmonics played alone with the right hand. And he combines them together. This is a beautiful shimmering sort of texture. You know, very, very beautiful. And he combines those two things together. So we had to come up with a way of writing that out. And I wanted to show you here's some more two-stage stuff. But particularly exciting here is what happens at the end. After this climactic moment, the last section of the work really emancipates the E. And he came up with this beautiful way of having harmonic open strings played and harmonics tapped out with the other hand. And this was one of the, when George was writing his PhD, he asked me to comment on the difficulties of these things. And one of the main difficulties that I noted with this was how to balance the length of the grace note, you know, of the open strings, before going on to the harmonics, to really make them sing. Because you could have quite an attacking one, with a lot of percussion, or without, you know, and you still get the nice, or, you know, you can have all these different ways. So it was really, you know, exciting for me to sit there and practice these grace note, I suppose what you'd call slapped harmonics, or tapped harmonics in some way. And so to give you a flavour of this ending, I'll just play a little bit. And that's the very end of the whole piece. I think that is a very clever way of using this low E. I'm going to come back to talk more about banging about this low E later on. That, you know, moves through the registers as we go through the piece. And at the end is flash. You know, you can hear it's the fundamental of the piece, but it's not stated all the time. You know, it's not always this E coming all the time. It does something really clever with it. And yeah, what I call the emancipation of the low E on the guitar. This collaboration between me and George has been extremely fruitful, and later on he also wrote me another piece. He wrote me a second sonata, which is in a completely different way. This downside with all this, of course, is the amount of tuning you have to do. The other day, as an aside, I designed a concert program for someone, and then I sent it off, and then I realised that it would necessitate taking 4 guitars with me because of all the different tunings. So anyway, I wrote back and said, well, I'm not sure I can actually do this one, we might have to think again. George's second sonata is very, very different, and it's a different kind of collaboration as well, because in the first sonata, he came up with all these huge pages and pages and pages of different chords and textures and stuff, and I said, oh, this one's really hard, and that one's even harder, and then he went away and picked those and put them together and made the structure that way. In the second sonata, really, he basically had the piece when he came to me, and but what we spent a million hours doing was voicing the chords. You'll see what I mean, voicing the harmonies. And because we found that he basically had the right notes, essentially all the time. He had the right chords, and he found the right registers and the right everything. But like for example, in the original one, he had this. The balance of this was this way around. Because, he imagined that this, if I have to do this with the right hand alone, will be very, very quiet and it won't speak. But it happens to be extremely resonant. And so we spent a long time and went through every bar in this, after he basically had the contour of the piece already done, rebalancing things across the two hands, or within one hand. There was another good example later on. He wanted lots of repetitions of that A harmonic. But again, it's extremely resonant. So we had to adjust. So we can get lots of more repetitions. I rebalanced it. And also, this comes back in the lesson. I don't know whether I left my finger on the node, I didn't take it away. So I achieved a little bit by just muting a tiny amount so that I can get more repetitions of that harmony. And that was most of the work that we did together. He basically had the piece already, and it seemed to come very, very quickly. And what he was focusing on was a kind of rhythmic structure that's based on the guitar. I didn't talk about the rhythms in the first sonata very much, but they're really hard. You get these bars that are, 2 2/3, 4 with chocolates everywhere, and it's in 3 different nested polyrhythms. And that's one kind of rhythmic organisation, but he wanted a different one for this, and he was thinking about how the guitar resonates, and that it's a decaying sound. Once you've attacked it, it's on its way out, it's dying. And so what he decided on was to come up with some guide tones, and then some repeating fragments, so that when you play the repeating fragments, you only do so for as long as the guide tone lasts. So here, on the top stave, you get the guide notes that are sustained as much as you possibly can. And then underneath are these repeating fragments. And you keep repeating the motif of each bar until the guide tones on the top has run out. So, now that is a very simple thing to say, and it's a very simple thing to write down. The subsidiary staves that are underneath are always repeating fragments in some way, and their length is controlled by the decay of the guide tones. And very cleverly, George chose sometimes extremely resonant guide tones, like the first one. They last really quite a long time, especially if what's on top is very quiet. And later on, there are some guide tones that go away very quickly. And so the pacing of the music is based on how long these guide tones last, rather than counting a beat or doing an accelerando. That's all built in naturally to what happens naturally in the guitar's resonance. But it's incredibly difficult to perform. From a performance point of view, this is really difficult because we come to the second kind of virtuosity here, really, which is this is a virtuosity based on listening, and a musical kind of virtuosity that is sometimes, I think, neglected. The hardest thing to do, as a performer, as an instrumentalist, is to really hear what you're doing as you're doing it, in real time, to appraise what you're doing in real time and respond to it. And this piece is completely based around that. That's what this piece is about, is having a structure that is entirely based on self-listening and self-awareness. Musical pacing is defined by how carefully you're listening to your own sound. So that's incredibly challenging. But it's not difficult for the hands. You might have noticed, I suppose in one way it's difficult for the hands, that most of these pieces have something where the right hand has to fret stuff or something weird happening, but someone you know, I only really play new music, and so those kind of techniques I would basically consider standard now. I don't really think of them as being extended techniques. And so when I say physically it's not difficult, I don't mean there's no monkey business going on, but I just mean that it's sort of standardish monkey business. And the real difficulty is how you listen. So I thought I might just play a little bit from this, and then we get the idea of the pacing of George's piece. Oh, and no, I said that in a minute. I think. Check the flag. Yes, I say that in a minute. Right, here we go. That's the first phrase. George builds in pauses during this, first sweep, I should say. Builds in pauses of silence that grow and contract throughout this. Immediately after what I just played, there's a 4-second silence. And the silences grow and contract as you go across the piece. And I suppose the silence infiltrates more and more, and then less and less and more, until you get this 32-second pause here, which is really difficult to pull off in a concert. Because the worst thing that can happen is someone applauds. You know, they think it's the end. And because, you're trying to create this amazing feeling of what, you have to try to make, as a performer, you have to try to make the air pregnant, with possibility that you might get a sound at any moment. And so I practiced sitting there for 32 seconds, quite a lot. I practiced quite a lot, finishing the last one. Which comes here. It's a very long gesture. The treble on the right hand of the fretted mode. That's that thing. And I suppose I pace it so that I don't do anything for a little while. Then as soon as I sort of see that someone might sort of shift in their chair, I move and pretend to get ready for the next one. On the left hand, and then get ready for the next one in the right hand. And eventually give the next note. But if you don't do anything, the illusion that something's going to happen dies, and then you might as well stop. And so that's a really difficult moment. That's potentially from a performance point of view, that's one of the hardest moments in that George and I have done together. It's very difficult, and sometimes you don't get it, and then people clap or whatever, which of course is a shame. But this piece is very beautiful, and writing about it later, George said that he felt like this piece was a watershed in some way, that a lot of the other pieces he'd written had been almost etudes building up to this. He felt that this was the sort of purest distillation of some technical concept, and it was the best, or the most overt relationship between a concept and the sounds produced. He felt that was the best, that he managed to do that. He didn't tell me this for years. I'd been performing this piece for, he finished it in 2014, and I'd probably been performing it for, 3 years or something. And then he kept telling me that there was a story behind it, and he would never tell me what it was. And I went to play a concert in China when he was living there, and he said, "Do you want to know the story?" And I said, no, don't tell me the story. And anyway, when we were doing the CD, he said, "I have to do it because it's got to go in the liner notes." And I said, "Oh, right, well, you better tell me then." And he said, "There's a poem that goes with it." And this was what he wrote for the CD. And then he quoted this poem, and it was going up to a church in Georgia. And this poem, I think, is actually sums it up extremely well. And so I think it would be worth we could just read that and have a moment. Just have a moment together. Extremely beautiful sentiment, and he really has captured something of the resonance of that space, in this that he's designed these harmonies. You probably spotted that the low E has disappeared again. We've once again managed to subvert that low E, and George has done the classic rock and roll thing of having drop D tuning, and that helps to create that very resonant sort of sound. It also avoids that cliche of things being stuck, based on E the whole time. Even though there's no spectral emanations in this piece, there's no account taken of the harmonic series, although it does use some natural harmonics. Essentially, these are all equally tempered pitches. But it still gets us outside of that guitar zone, of having dominated by the open string tuning. And so, another piece that does just that is a sort of old classic of the repertoire. Maybe not an old classic, but certainly one that people know and other guitarists other than me have played, which is Tristan Murray's epic piece, Terreur. Here's his program note. He is a spectralist. He's a bona fide spectralist. And he writes a lot of music based on process, how you can evolve one sound into the next in a smoothly transitional sort of way. This is quite hard to do on the guitar because, what we were saying a minute ago, the thing that George revelled in, the decaying nature of the attack, you have the attack and then it decays, is exactly what Tristan doesn't really want. The idea that you need something sustained in order for the thing to evolve. If you keep attacking the thing, it might interfere with the process. And so he found a solution, though, and he found a solution in the guitar playing of flamenco, the flamenco guitar, because of all these kinds of strumming that flamenco guitarists are so good at. What's called the rasguado strumming technique, which can be as simple as one finger coming down, away, or 2, or 3, or 4, or 5, and if you combine them in various different combinations, you can make essentially a continuous sort of rolling sort of sound. And in fact, then he designed the whole piece really about that sort of dramatic attitude towards guitar playing. He doesn't say it in this program note, but in the score, in the preface to the score, he said that Terreur should be performed with a great range of expression, with violence and brightness, and with great gentleness. As a whole, the sound should be nearer that of the flamenco guitar than of the classical guitar. He even writes classical guitar. I'm sure you've heard flamenco music. The reason they have so much attack is really threefold. One is that the strings function at a much higher tension than classical guitar strings, even though they're still nylon. They're functioning at a much higher tension. And people aren't that fussed about, delicate, this sort of sound. This sort of Rodrigo sound. They're not that fussed about that in flamenco guitar music. So their nails, they shape them, but then a lot of people paint them with glue or God knows what, and layer them up with tissue paper and glue, so you get a really hard attacking sort of sound. He really harnesses that, and this piece is very exciting. And I'll show you something of the tuning that he uses. He also gets rid of this low E, but instead of going down, we start by going up. The low C and the low E is now an F. And extrapolating a rough harmonic series, the D becomes E flat. An equally tempered E flat, so that you get this rub against, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This rub against equal temperament and the natural overtone series, which is very beautiful. Well, in my view. And so the combination of, this is really, I think in programming songwriting, right, this is spectral music, but seen through or flamenco music seen through a spectral filter. I wanted to show you, if I do that, it'll give me 2 pages. Yeah, so this is the notation that he uses, which is essentially time-space. Thinking about process-driven music, he writes what he wants to happen on the stave, and then above, you see the letter A, in the box there it says 30 or 40, and that means 30 or 40 seconds until the next thing, which is here, until the next section. So you spend, if you're going to practice this piece, you spend a lot of time with a stopwatch or a clock, measuring your instinct for are you getting it right. It's not very organic to play with a stopwatch, and it's too regimented, but because you might not have judged the change of the sound right, if you measure it with a watch, you're on some sort of promise, to have got it right. But if you do it without, you can have a few seconds either way, but you need to develop an instinct for are you getting it right, are the proportions correct. And so I'll play the beginning of this, because the beginning is rather special, and it shows the spectralists and something I share with spectral composers an interest in all the different kinds of sounds, and the effect of the timbre is very important. So there's a note here that's muted, and then the string is played with in that rasguado pattern with the back of the nail, but you can hear there's pitches inside it coming off the back of the nail. Very high note. And he even works out what pitches they are and writes them in. So you have to find exactly the right place and spacing to get that little scale. Which takes ages to find, you sort of realise as you're playing that you're drifting around, you don't realise how much you move until you do it. Anyway, I shall attempt to play at the beginning of Telur, so you can get into the sort of dramatic and process-driven work here. on into the next section. That's really the first big major sweep of the work. And it demonstrates something that this piece has in common with George's, which is that this A is put in loads of different places and the different colours. This is something that we'll see links to my music a bit as well. And a lot of the pieces in this CD have an interest in that, which is different colours of the same note. This is avoidable really when we're dealing with the harmonic series. You probably noticed there that this note is an A, but it's sort of muted, and then it becomes a harmonic on A again, and then you press down, it becomes an A for real, and then it becomes an A across two strings, and then comes back as a harmonic, and later on it becomes a harmonic across two strings. And this is really interesting because that one will be perfectly in tune, that's equally tempered because it's on an A string, and that one will be in flat because it's functioning as the fifth partial of an F. So it'll be 14% flat. So again, you get that very beautiful rub, yeah? And then he turns it into a normally fretted A with a very beautiful sound. He writes double chains. And then you get these lovely cascading phrases. So the same colour, the same note, which I think really makes this music, because, if you've got, when a kid colours in a tree or something, the trunk, they just brown, they just get like on paint, on the computer, you get the film tool, you just brown. But when an artist does it, it's like 15 different kinds of brown, and there's probably some green on the trunk as well, and some black, and all sorts like this where the light goes. And, this is the same sort of thing, but with notes. Different colours of the same note. You can have an A, but that doesn't mean very much. What kind of A? What kind of A have you got? What kind of A? What's it doing in the music? I think that's really important. Then during this piece, he doesn't stick only to having this tuning on F. If I take you a turn, I can show you some of the technical aspects of this. Over here, at the bottom of this page, the F changes down, you go all the way down to C sharp, which is very beautiful, a slightly unexpected thing. And on this chord, you can hear something's changing, but you're not quite sure how. And then one by one, you remove the other strings. Low C sharp out of nowhere, which I think that's one of the great reveals, in contemporary guitar. Out of nowhere you get this amazing C sharp, and the whole axis of the piece. Bang on, look at that. I don't know whether you can see on screen, but I had to work out how many times you have to turn the down peg, to get close. About somewhere between 5 or 6, and then you sort of work it out. I should also show you a practical consideration here. Where I've circled one of these gestures and it says check tuning. There's a funny story attached to that, which is when Elliot Fisk premiered the Berrio guitar sequencer, which is very violent and lots of rasguado strumming and bar-top pits and this sort of thing all over the place. He got to the middle of the work and found that the guitar was horrendously out of tune and struggled even to get to the end, And so if you look at the score now, about 2/3 of the way through this guitar sequencer, there's a passage where each open string note is just in repeat brackets, one after the other. And Berrio built it in as a sort of check the tuning game, so that you could carry on and play the rest of the work. So sometimes, you shouldn't give all the secrets away, but this is, the art of the performer is you've got to find a way to make this stuff work in real life. There's still 4 minutes of the piece left to go, so you can't sit there and play with a dodgy C sharp for 4 minutes, you've got to do something. So sometimes in concert, if you're having a bad day, or it's really hot or really cold, or the strings are rubbish, I repeat that gesture and make a conscious effort to check the tuning there. And not to sort of tell you sound scores doesn't exist, but performers have to do this sort of thing sometimes. This is real life, and you're trying to give the audience something. So, your artistic conscience couldn't let you sit there and play a dodgy C sharp for the next 4 minutes. You've got to do something about it, find a way. That's a good tip for performers. Find a way to make it work. I think another performing pattern here is to get the drama. We talked about the proportional thing. This is an extremely dramatic work. we heard in the opening, how dramatic it is. And it's very important to capture that, and it's about proportion. You know, it's no good here if something that says it's 30, well, that says 38 seconds or something. You know, it's no good if that is a minute and a half. You know, it's okay if it's 44 seconds or something, or 30, you know, but it's no good if it's double the length it's supposed to be, because he's worked out the proportions carefully. So, and that's probably the biggest intellectual challenge in this, is to assimilate and understand the dramatic contour of the thing, you know, and how to project that to an audience. And sometimes, you know, I mean, he's a master, Mariah's a master, you know, knows what he's doing. But there are some places where I think, oh no, I do a bit more or a bit less, you know. And I don't think performers should ever feel coy about doing that, or telling composers that they're going to do that, or that they intend to do that. Because you're the one that has to sit there and convince people, you know, that this is worth having, you know, in their lives. So I think that's quite important. From a technical point of view, there's all these strumming things, but there's also some interesting dexterity things like this, where the right and the left hand have independent staves again, and this becomes, you know, what the left hand's going to do. And then if I show you over the page here, the right hand has a contour, but it's an independent contour of what the left hand's going to do. So there I'm trying to crescendo with the left hand first, and away, and the right hand later, and then away again. And hopefully when you get them two together, you get more of the G sharp and then something of that one, and hopefully they sort of dovetail against each other, one and then the other, and one and then the other. And he's a big, you know, he's a big fan of doing this sort of thing. Here at letter 12, there's a very nice one which has this. The left hand comes first, the right hand comes first, and dims. And then the left hand takes over. And that's this. And that's quite a beautiful one because they're the same. You know, they're the same sort of pitches. Takes you off on the next piece and on to the next section. So there's some interesting, you know, it's almost like being a piano player. Can you get two different contours happening at the same time? I wanted to show you just one more of those, which is really, really overt. Yeah, it's here, at the bottom of this page. From here, yeah, this is my favourite marking in any of these scores. Here, that's flaccid next to this chord here, which I think is an extraordinary, you know, sort of moment for that. Anyway, the left hand starts very quiet. Crescendos a bit, and then the right hand comes. Left hand's up as loud as you can get. The right hand comes through, and goes away. But the left hand never stopped and tried to sustain that thing. So there's sort of a change of perspective and a change of focus from one hand to the other, and from one harmony to the next. Makes for an incredibly exciting, hopefully, makes for an incredibly exciting experience for the listening. And they're not sure, you know, where something's coming from. And all the time there's some process going on. I think it was interesting to record this piece, wasn't it, John? Because all of this stuff where you get your mind, these really high pitches off the back of the nail are very beautiful, but we had to think of a way to capture them. Can you say something about what you did?
Yeah, I think we just used a lot more microphones than we normally would.
Yes.
Partly because we were in a nice church, so we put some distant ones, but also we put a really close one, or two.
I think we had two. I think we had one and another big one here.
Very close to the normal distance, and then two further away. And that means, depending on the piece or the part of the piece, we could bring out certain things.
Exactly.
Especially subtle.
I remember in the edit we spent quite a this. Oh, it's on the wrong tuning now, but this section. We spent quite a long time working out how to get that, because some of those pitches he writes are indeterminate, and some of them he actually writes what pitch he wants, you know. So we worked quite hard to bring them out, and I think that was right. I remember having a big thing here that I had to not hit, you know, and I got carried away. Yeah. So that was an interesting experience, you know, to try to work out how to bring that out in the recording. have to talk about the only piece on this disc that has standard tuning. When I started thinking about trying to make this CD, I wanted something that had a different kind of resonance. You know, all of these pieces so far revel in the sustaining and decaying resonance of the guitar in some way, and most of them have an interest in the harmonic series and use altered tunings to best effect to get that. And so I wanted something that has a different approach to the sort of resonant feeling of the guitar. And so I knew that Christopher had a piece, and I heard it because I heard Diego play it. And he had an extremely fine version of this piece. And so I really wanted to play Christopher's piece, which is called Chili, and there's the first page. And one other thing that's interesting is this piece had a link to other historical guitar associations, or the heritage of the guitar. You know, the Flamenco Association of the Morai is very interesting, and this has a sort of historical association to South American music, and particularly the idea of additive rhythms. Would you like to say something about that? Anyway, and so I can show you a little bit of what I mean before I say some of the things that I think are important technical details about this piece, and then some important aesthetic things. And then I might persuade Christopher to say something. I think before I do that, I should say that one interesting thing about putting a program together is how the pieces relate to each other on a sonic level, not just on a sort of program level. I need something from this place or that time or whatever. But all of this stuff in Morai made me think a lot about how to attack the chords in Christopher's piece, because it's based exclusively on chordal playing, you know. And so at the beginning, I was always playing this, you know, in the normal way, strummed on the thumb, with a little bit of nail, you know, in the normal way. And I like that, but I remember one concert I played Telur, and then I played your piece. And I thought, oh, I wonder, what if I do the start with the back of the nail? Because you hit, you know, that sort of thing. And anyway, I really liked it. Anyway, that's a sort of aside. And though I never told you that I did that. Anyway, and so, you know, that's not necessarily it wasn't an academically informed decision. It wasn't anything that I had thought about. It was just something in the moment I thought, I wonder. And, you know, that's why that's something about live performance. You know, you have to, sometimes, you just have to do something in the moment, you know, that might be really good or it might not be. Performers sometimes have to take a risk and do something. I haven't decided where I'll keep it, but anyway. So I'll play a little bit to show you the kind of rhythmic language that we're talking about. Kind of rhythmic language. What I love about this is that, you know, you feel like you're getting into a groove and then it shifts you know, a tiny bit, and you're constantly being wrongly right, you know, or rightly wrong, but you're getting into a groove and then it shifts on to the next thing. And I think, talking of, you know, the different approach to resonance that I was talking about earlier with this, it's to do with a kind of resonance that stops, you know, one that you hear a colour, and it's not quite so in here, but then you sort of have you know, a memory of that resonance. And each one, I find it quite, what's the word? Well, I think I find it quite beguiling in a way, because, you know, you have one chord, and because they come in sometimes long, but sometimes short patterns, you haven't always got a handle on what's going to come next, and because it's always usually preceded by a percussive attack, you can't always exactly remember what the pitch was, so the pitch relationships are kind of not always overt. You know, if I played you know, it loses almost all of its identity. You know, even though some people would say, "Oh, it's more resonant," but I'm not sure that it is, because it has it's too what's the word? Well, it's cheap, isn't it? It's rubbish. It's boring. It's rubbish. It's rubbish. You know, it has no life at all. All those rhythmic inflections that are written in here, the tuplets, are very interesting, because you might notice that lots of them have got things written in my pencil markers over the top, like the top of the first one, 89.6. That's the metronome mark, that's the BPM that tuplet runs at. And Christopher's very specific here on the inside front cover, where you get all the goodies about how to do it. He says that all of these tuplets are not inflections of the main pulse, but they function as basically independent tempi. You know, it's like one tempo is being switched on, and then one tempo is being, you know, switched off. And so I spent a lot of time when I was working on this piece working out how to switch from one to the other. And I remember when we were making the recording, there was one particular one where I think I got stuck a little bit, and you gave me a clue with a metronome to do one section. But in a concert, of course, that can't happen, so you have to spend a long time. Where are all the bits that are 70 beats per minute? So I made a little list of where all the bits that are, you know, in that 5 to 8 tuplet, which is where mine is, which is the slowest one, 70 BPM, and I made a list of where they all are, took them out and practiced them on their own as fragments. And then, hopefully, when you put them back in, when you get there, your instinct for what it is to play those fragments at 70 BPM kicks in, and you can do it, you know, or close enough for rock and roll anyway, you know, when you're in the moment. But that's incredibly precisely written, and it really means something. If you don't get the inflections right again, you lose something of the music and its rhythmic language. All of that percussive stuff is also notated. The what looks like a giant note head with the stem going right down through it. That's all this percussive stuff. And I remember we discussed how much click. This guitar has quite a high action, and it's not always practical to get lots of click. But I played it to you on another one with a lower action, and then I remember you said, "Oh, it's too much click." And so, and then I went away and I came back with this guitar, and you said, "Oh, that's not enough." So I was doing less, and I had a guitar that it's harder to do it on. It's amazing how much, you know, that sort of thing affects psychologically what you do when you play. Someone says, "Do less." So you do less, but you have to take into account the situation as well, and the room. It's not bad, is it? Yeah, it's quite good in here. Also, just to talk about virtuosity, the virtuosity that you require for this is the third kind of virtuosity. The virtuosity that you require here is rhythmic, essentially, to be able to function in independent tempi. Talking about the sequenza earlier, it reminded me of an analysis that I read of the guitar sequenza that also has lots of different tempi, and it was called a polyphonic form of listening. And I think this piece requires a polyphonic form of performance, except it's a sort of polyrhythmic form that you have to have some tempo, and then you remember what that is, and you go away using it, and then you snap back to that one. You know, and they're related to each other. It's like a sort of polyphonic form of practice. The other stamina-based virtuosity is what you need for this. This is incredibly tiring, this piece. It's about 11 minutes, maybe 10 or 11 minutes, and every single chord, if you play the guitar, you know that every single chord being a barre chord for full barre across all 6 strings for 10 minutes or 11 minutes is very tiring. And that also has an impact on one's practice when you're trying to put this together for a concert, because you can't play it 10 times. You know, you can really only play it all the way through with all of the repeated fragments, maybe twice before you're a spent force. So you have to sort of think, you know, plan what you're going to do. It really is stamina for the left hand, and also stamina for the right hand. I haven't played this piece in a concert for a little while, and you can see it, maybe you can't see, but even after just playing the first page, I have little, you know, from doing all of this, little red marks here, and I remember sending you a photograph of my hand bleeding after practicing this, because one of my favourite things that happens here at the end is the shift from strumming to rubbing with the knuckle across the string, and this is an incredibly beautiful shift. You know, after all of these hands on fire, you know, not 10 minutes in. You know, it's a very, very beautiful shift, and that's a very special articulation. You know, I think that's a really wonderful ending, and that takes, you know, time to get the right sort of sound. It's very easy to get too much bass. You make sure you get all the pitches. It's quite difficult. So I think those are the main sort of kinds of virtuosity that you need in here. The precision of the notation is quite amazing. We talked about the rhythms and the percussive nature, but also how much to strum by is given by how many fingers are indicated in this pattern here. 2 fingers, 2 fingers, 2 fingers, and 5 for the rasguado strums. So every time you get a chord like that, this arc at the top shows you, you know, how many fingers it is. 2 or 3, 4, or 5, or continuous. You know, later on there's a continuous one. So that kind of precision also, you know, matters. The articulation, you know, that really, really matters. There are some things that I like to play around with in here sonically. You get lots of repeated fragments later on. There's one, I think it comes 7 times. Yeah, here it is. Where on the muted, you know, these are all different, and you know, I think there's something nice about thinking about that. That's a good one. You know, depending on the venue, I'll change those. You know, if it's really bright venue, you can do something with the flesh maybe. Or if it's really, if it's quite dead, you need something brighter. I really, you know, enjoy the process of playing around with those sort of things. And finding something that works for each performance. You were talking about making performance, you know, each performance is slightly different. And sometimes, I think, you can't change everything every time, because otherwise it's going to be rubbish. But, you know, I think sometimes things have to be different, because you're playing in a different room, in a different size audience, you know, anything could be different. And so you are different too, you have to be different. And you have to be alive to what's going on, you know, in the performance that you're giving. So I think that's very important. Would you like to say something?
I think you said it, actually. I mean, the thing that I have forgotten, which is exactly that thing that you're talking about with all the barre fingerings, that the whole point of the piece is
yes.
At no point does it ring.
No, that's right, exactly.
Which is, and I think it's one of the things that makes the guitar really interesting as an instrument, is
yes.
that it's I can't think of another instrument where you can so comprehensively cut off
all everything. Yeah, yeah. Yes, exactly.
Because otherwise, I mean, guitar is such a problematic instrument. It's so bloody difficult.
It's so
difficult to every other instrument, because the tuning is so difficult. But what you can do with your left hand is so incredibly awkward.
Yes, exactly.
So in a way, I've solved the problem as I think I often do, which is by just finding a way of unguitaring the guitar as possible.
But it's very interesting because, of course, if you have a barre in every chord, this is what I was saying about changing the tuning without changing the tuning.
Yeah.
Because this is essentially like chopping bits off the neck, you know, each time. You know, so, but, and by adding other things, you've got sort of, I don't know how many chord shapes there are, there's not that many, 6 different shapes. And so you've really got sort of 6, every time you move that, you're on a new guitar, almost. Yeah. Except that, there's always some remnant of the basic tuning of a guitar, So I think it's both, you've un-guitared it, but you've also intrinsically guitared it at the same time.
It's a South American tradition. I mean, it does, even though those chords are all, whatever they are.
Yeah.
They do sound vaguely, vaguely South American as well.
It's exactly, yeah.
Which goes with all the twos and threes in the rhythm.
Twos and threes.
The whole piece is basically a rumba.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
Yeah. You played beautifully.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So that piece is very important in this program because it brings another way of looking at resonance on the guitar and another way of dealing with the guitar, which is different to the others. I think that it wouldn't be. I don't want to spend too long talking about my music, but I want to just mention one little piece that's on this CD because I found some interesting things when I thought about George's second sonata because. Because it is important in his music, in his second sonata, to get the proportions right by really listening to the guide tones. But I noted that when you have the repeating fragments, as the guide tone fades away and you diminuendo on the repeating fragments, you essentially accel every time, you accelerate, because a quieter sound will last less long. So if I have a guide tone like this, and this has to dim, and I repeat it every time it becomes silent, if I strike it less hard, it becomes shorter each time by default. So as the music diminuendos, it essentially speeds up. And if it were to do a crescendo, it would do the opposite. And that struck me as something that I wanted to do something with, because that's basically the opposite to the standard dramatic contour of Western music, which is that as we get loud, if we get faster, we get louder. If we want to do a climax in a composition, the sort of classic way of doing that is to get louder and faster, and build towards a climax. But in this kind of music, if you had a note that gets longer, or a note that gets louder, it will get longer if you let them pause, if you hold them until they're inaudible. And so that's what I made for this piece. And so anyway, I'll just play a little bit because I want to tell you about Revelescu. Here's the video. And you see that as I play stronger, it lasts a longer length of time. And the same thing in the next phrase. And so that is essentially the expressive contour that I was interested in for this piece. It's sort of flipped around. So and later at the other end of the piece, there's some very loud G sharps that and as they fade out, they speed up. So you're sort of accelerating towards silence all the time. And I do think that that's an interesting sort of byproduct of plucked sound. That's something about the poetry of plucked sound, because you're always dealing with the birth and the death of the thing. Because once you've plucked it, it's always going to decay, it's going to disappear. And so dealing with connecting one note to the next is very difficult because of that. So how you judge the next attack relevant to the previous one, to get a smooth phrase or a contour like this, is very important. There's no technical innovations really in this little piece of mine, except maybe this, what I call fake pits, which is done with the right hand, and you pluck a harmonic, but away from the node. And then move towards the node or away from it, so that the pitch disappears, you know, and that's the only sort of technique. I haven't really sort of thought about that before. That's a nice way to get it. You know, you can grow into them. But you have to be careful because the partials are very close together. So if you get it just right, you can only move by a tiny line. Otherwise you get a different note. But that is an interesting expressive contour, and that was my sort of main contribution to the thing. It's only a 3-minute little piece. And here's a good tip as well for people making CDs, which is that if you're a performer and you also write your own music, but you don't always do the two things together, it's a very good idea to put a little piece of yours on your CD, because then when you go to a composer thing, as a composer, you can still follow them. It's a very, very important practical tip there for anybody who's going to start making CDs, and a way to generate some revenue. So the final piece that I want to talk about is this, which is, I'm going to change details, which is a piece by Metier Records, who's one of my favourite composers. He's one of my heroes, I think. And change guitars, put to the steel screen. And this piece has an interesting history with me because it was introduced to me by Christian Mason, a composer friend of mine. When I'm not doing soloist things, I play in a group called the Octandra Ensemble, a new music group that he co-directs with John Hargreaves. You can hear us on Radio 3 this Saturday night at 10 p.m. And playing a piece by Frank Denyer. And they were putting on a small-scale concert and said, "Can you play some solos?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll play Mariah and whatever." And they said, "It's a Radulescu thing. We really want you to play some Radulescu. There's this piece for guitar and electronics or digital sound." And I said, "Great, fantastic. But I haven't got the score." And they said, "Oh, well, you'll find it." I said, "Well, I tried and I couldn't find it." And then Bob Gilmore had custody of Radulescu's materials, and specifically in the form of a hard drive, the contents of a hard drive, and which he very kindly gave to us, or to Christian specifically. And Christian said, "I've got the Radulescu." It was this sort of thing, "I've got the Radulescu." And so he gave me this score, and it comes as this huge, page after page of handwritten stuff, that doesn't make any sense because he's sort of writing in his third language or something. And then this score, which looks like this. And you have to sort of work out what's going on. And this Radulescu, I think, represents for me the fourth kind of virtuosity on this disc, which is some sort of conceptual virtuosity, and a sort of intellectual stamina to work out what the hell's going on and how it all is supposed to be working. Fortunately, Radulescu did do a lot of interviews. There's a really good one I can recommend in Contemporary Music Review, 2003, by Bob Gilmore, and it's called Wild Ocean. And it's an interview, and in it they describe quite beautifully Radulescu's technique, and specifically this stuff that he says his pieces are based on, called sound plasma. And it says, "Radulescu's works are built from sound situations created by different treatments of fundamentals, the spectra produced by these treatments, and the isolation of individual spectra. The music results naturally from the initial organisation of sound sources and formal structures. Its interest lying in the interaction of the resulting harmonics, different tones, subtones, rhythmic beats, and so on. The texture thus produced is called the sound plasma." And this is a great quote, and it really gives an insight into Radulescu's sound plasma. So what are the basic materials of this piece? Well, to show you that, I have to explain about the tuning. Here's the tuning, which is very nice, and it's based on this Overtone series. This is the Overtone Spectrum of C, and the deviations above are shown in cents, 1/100th of a semitone being a cent, and the 6 strings of this guitar are tuned to an E, but 14 cents flat, representing, like, for example, the 5th partial, E, and if you double it, the 10th partial, and so on. And then the 5th string is a G sharp, it's 40 cents, nearly 41 cents above, and that one is taken from the 13th partial, one in red, and then the 4th string D is nearly 4 cents sharp, and so that gives you the 9th partial or the 18th. You know, it just depends on the register. The equivalent partial number is always deviant by the same amount of cents. It just depends on the register that you're working in. The G is 2 cents sharp, so that could be, you know, that's partials 3 or 6 and so on. And that keeps going forever and ever. The second string is a B, 12 cents flat. And so on this diagram, the only time you see the B is at the 15th partial. And then that's an F sharp, except it's 50 cents flat or 49 cents flat. And so that's the 11th partial or the 22nd off the end of the diagram. And so that is essentially, this guitar is now set up, believe it or not, to play in C. That is the natural overtone series of C. So it's not in tune. Well, it's more in tune than equal temperament. This is the tuning of the universe. And that's something that's important to say about Brunel with the sound plasma idea. Because what I think we hear is this sort of primordial, almost violent sort of sound. We hear, you know, the sounds of the universe are in this, sounds of nature are inside this music. And all of this piece is plucked on natural harmonics along each of these strings. And what he's indicating is which strings are plucked, string numbers in circles, and which partials of the harmonic series. So that's 7th partials of the 13th, with different kinds of attacks. So one can have an attack that you play and you release immediately, get the maximum amount of resonance, or a second kind of attack, that's the one that looks like a note head that's not coloured in. Then you get one that's coloured in halfway, and that's what I was describing earlier, where I leave my finger on the plucked, on the node. And it mutes it slightly, and you can also have one with pressure, with no resonance, but you still get the pitch. And that's when he colours the note head in full, like down here on the 5th line. But getting to know where they are is very difficult because he doesn't tell you what pitches they sound on the score, he just tells you what partials play. So I spent ages playing arpeggios in natural harmonics so that I could learn, you know, where they are along each string. That was a long process. He also, shall we say, he also introduces the bow in playing the thing. This is one reason I choose to play this piece on steel strings, because the natural harmonics ring very well. They ring very, very well, and the bow reacts extremely well. On the nylon strings, it doesn't grip quite as well. And he defines several different bowing techniques. One, this sort of flotando bowing on one string. This only ever happens on the 6th string. One that comes across all strings, and these lunges, which are extraordinary art. They're absolutely extraordinary. One thing that I found with the bow, this is a cello bow, it seems to work best, and you need to be really tight. I mean, that's really tight. I don't know what sort of sound you get on a cello with a bow this tight. And also, really loaded with rosin. The most maximum amount of rosin you can get to really activate the partials, you know, of the string. And I think that is the key I've found anyway to the bowing. On a what shall I say? A postural note. Normally, I used to like the, you know, sit with the guitar like this or some way, but playing, you know, harmonics here, and then there's a big problem with this. I've seen people play. I've seen one other person ever play this piece, and they did this all the time. Now, there's no curvature or very little radius on the guitar fingerboard, and so it's very difficult to not get lots of strings if you choose to do it this way. It's also incredibly easy to just spend your whole time bowing a hole in the, you know, in the edge of the guitar and not actually get any purchase on the strings at all. And so I had this idea that because I'm sure we all know this, that about the octave partial, the first harmonic or the second partial of the string, the thing's symmetrical. You know? So whatever exists down here must exist up here as well in terms of natural overtones. And so I just thought, well, I'll play whatever I play here, I'll play it at the other end of the string. And I'll sit like this. And then when I come to do the bowing, it doesn't matter, I don't need to bow up here, I can bow down here, because it's the same. I get the same overtone, you know, I get the same partial. And that way I haven't got the body in the way. So that's my sort of contribution to modern guitar performance practice, is the idea that one would sit like a lap steel, you know, then there's no problem with getting the bow on one string or the other string. I mean here, I don't understand how to get, you know, just the first string that I mean is rubbish, you know, it's just pathetic. So, that's a really important development. When I sort of realised, I thought, I can actually play this piece now. You know. This piece has some electronics that go with it. They're not really electronics, they're just digital sound. But it's interesting, in that hard drive that we managed to get from Bob, we had this really interesting folder that had not quite as processed as they are in fine thick sound. So we were able to say that really they're bells. This is the first one that we found. You can hear there's a bell-like sound and it's being processed in some way with some sort of sampler or filter or something. And then we found another level, this one's called number 2. So filtered in some way that makes them interact with each other. You can still hear ding, 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 it's the same bell. And for the real deal, the processing is even more amped up, and that's what we get for the final track that you play with. And against this, I play on the first bit. So well against this backdrop. It's very beautiful. And when the bow comes in, vary the bow point, you get these beautiful harmonics you can produce. And the very direct bow gestures were extremely well against this backdrop. When we do this one live, John often presses go on the thing, and I have a stopwatch here, because this is laid out, you know, a minute for each line of the score. And do you ever, when we have a guest, do you ever vary the sound as I get, yeah. And it's something that we did for the CD as well, is that when we get to a loud bit, you just push up the you know, electronic sound a little bit and then bring down. So it becomes more organic, you know, rather than just having something that's completely static and then over the top somebody playing things. It makes it a lot more organic for the stage. And I think we captured, you know, some really exciting takes doing it that way, by having this, you know, the digital sound becomes part of the performance in some way. I suppose that really leads me to the final thing, which is to say, what next? You know, all of these things have been. Oh yeah, I need to come back to this one. Those are just a reminder. Those are the things that I talked about, and across all of these things. So where's this going next? Well, I think that we're... Oh, sorry, how did that get in there? The next thing that I suppose that I wanted to explore a little bit were a more detailed influence of live electronics. How the electronics can not only be manipulated by a person, like when John and I play the Ravelescu together, but how they can respond to what the guitar's doing in a live way. I wanted to show you one piece just to finish that does that. other thing is what happens on the other side of the fretted note. The composer Patricia Alessandrini and the guitarist Maurizio Carrasco made a piece that was based on what happens on what the pitch is on the other side of the fretted note. And so one I'd like to explore further with her and other composers, what happens when if you mute the strings here, then it's that side of the string that resonates, that side of my hand. You can get some fantastic microtonal interactions that way. So everything muted here, what happens on the wrong side of the note is very, very interesting. So those are the two main things that I would like to explore a bit further with these composers and on my own a little bit maybe as well. And so just to give you a flavour of some of that, this is a piece that I've been performing a lot recently. This is called Semantron, and it's by Nicholas Moros, who directs the Explore Ensemble, and it uses some live electronics, some granular synthesis, and a microtonal tuning. You play exclusively in natural harmonics. With a contact mic on the guitar, and that picks up the sound. And these beautiful beating patterns. And at the start there's no electronics. And if I skip on a little bit, you start to hear some resonance in the background. It's about 12 minutes long. Start to hear this ghostly shimmer in the background. The way this works is through granular synthesis and sampling. You sample either an attack or a resonance, and then you apply a filter to it that is like a delay pedal, but also transposition. It transposes up or down by a small amount, and then a bigger amount, and a bigger amount, and a bigger amount. And eventually, at the end, the rhythmic increments of the delay are all in play, the very short ones and the round ones, and the pitch space, 2 octaves down, and also 2 octaves up, and all the small intervals in between. And once you set it going, it's bounced around the audience stereophonically between speakers. So this is a recording from a concert in October that I gave for the first time I played this piece. And so that gives you some flavour of where things might be heading next. And so that sort of brings to a conclusion, hopefully elucidated many points, my practice and how I work with composers, the collaborations that are involved, and how we put this project together. And so I'd like to thank Christopher and John for their inputs and also for having me to give this seminar. I hope you found it interesting, and if there are any questions, I'm very happy to answer any and all questions. And I have got some CDs, just in case. You can have a special student discount as well. Anyway, thank you very much. Also, I realise that I run over a little bit, so if you do need to go, no problems.
Sam,
yes.
So hugely comprehensive. Are there any questions? I mean, fantastic, really.
Oh, well, thank you.
Really, very interesting indeed. Well, thinking of live electronics, I mean, I heard this piece when you played here.
Yeah.
Have you got other pieces lined up?
Yes.
Composers lined up?
Yes, other composers lined up. I want some composers that I've been talking to about something like this, but not exactly like this. Composers like Lily Harris and Sarah Westwood. And I would like to do something with them. Sarah has an interest in specialisation, and so that could be something that would be very interesting to do. And Lily has a fantastic piece for voice and live electronics, which was about mechanistic process being interrupted in some way by machines. I think that I think the idea behind that piece, if I remember correctly, is that the idea was flipped around so that the voice acts mechanistically, and it's the electronics that make the sort of organic interruption to the process. Something like that could be very fertile on the guitar, you know, with the resonance of a good tune or something, you know. Yeah. But yes, you know, I would really like to develop a bit more. I have ideas for a disc of guitar and live electronics, of which this piece would definitely be one. Yeah.
Sarah?
That was very eloquent and a complete surprise to me because I don't know anything about guitar at all. I wonder how you feel about using words to talk about music, because I always find that's a huge problem.
Well, when you're trying to explain something or say what you feel.
Writing about anything, really, writing about it, talking about it, I just want to say, you just...
I find it very difficult in a way, in some ways, but speaking personally, the less that I plan, I mean, you know, if you know what the thing that you're talking about, the less I plan, the better it is, you know.
The
less I plan what I'm going to say.
Oh, right, yeah.
You know, generally speaking, the better I do, you know. I think, and, you know, if you give a lot of concerts, you get used to having to talk to the audience, you know, make stuff up, or, you know, fill time, or, you know, if there's problems. So, I think...
You don't really sort of like pulls the music down to the level of words.
Well, I think...
Not suggesting it does, I'm just asking.
I think it might, but that's one reason why I chose to not play many recordings and actually play the guitar in these things. You know, whenever I do these things, I always try to play, you know, if I'm here, you know, and talking about music that I'm supposed to know something about, you know, I might as well play, and I think that those two things together can work well.
Yeah.
I don't think I could see it working for me personally, if I was talking about guitar music, then, you know, I would always like to play. I don't think I could see myself doing it without that. If I just played recordings from the CD, you know, I think that then maybe I would run the risk of what you're saying.
Yeah.
But you have to be able to say something.
Yes.
Because otherwise there's no point being here. So, you know, otherwise we just have a concert, you know, and then I could just play the pieces. But if we want to say something, we have
I enjoyed it. I liked
say
it.
Yeah. So I think there's a danger, but I think...
Thank you.
If you keep it musical, you know.
Yes.
Yeah, then definitely.
So what made you make the transition? Obviously you went from classical guitarist to like doing more contemporary pieces. What made you make that transition?
Well, I think two things initially. Well, not initially. One thing first, which was that I liked it better. Well, I liked it a lot. You know, I really liked working with composers. I really liked the idea that what you were doing was something. You didn't have to work really hard to make it a living performance practice, you know, because you could both sort of talk to each other, you know, and so it was immediately gives you a good feedback. You go and work with the composer, and you come back and you've got some new ideas and you do it. So I liked it a lot because of that. I've always liked new music, and it was something that I thought, you know, that this kind of music in guitar is not really done very much. There's only a sort of a handful of us really playing this kind of music, and because, you know, there is new music being written for guitar, but a lot of it's by guitarists, you know, who were maybe guitarists before they did something about writing music, and a lot of that kind of music is heavily rhythmic, maybe some percussive things, you know, rhythmic riffs and things like that, and that wasn't something that I was interested in. You know, I was always much more interested in pitch, the way the pitch drives music, and the way that the Overtone series drives things. So So I liked it a lot. I always liked new music, and I thought it was lacking in guitar, so I wanted to do it. And then once I started doing it, the second thing is that, you know, I realised that I could do it. You know, that this music spoke to me in some way that I could understand, and I think that's a really important point, you know, for a performer. If you're going to, you know, go and play concerts as part of a career or something, you need to play things that you can do intuitively and organically well, you know, something that you can really do well, naturally. That's not to say that, you know, you sit down and everything's easy. That's not quite what I mean. I mean something that you really understand, you know, intuitively inside yourself. Otherwise you're going to get found out, you know. And I think that at the start of my career, I put some of these pieces, not these pieces, but other pieces that people have in programs, and maybe, but with other things, from standard repertoire that maybe didn't suit me very well. I think, being brutally honest, I wasted some time at the very start playing things in concerts that didn't play to my strength, that didn't suit me. You know, that I liked the music, but somehow I couldn't intuitively and organically give that to an audience. You you know. And then when I started really getting heavily into new music and working with composers, I sort of realised, I know this is something that I really understand, you know, and I really feel I can communicate, you know, to an audience. So I think it was those two things. You know, I liked it, and then I found that I was good at it, you know. And so those two things together are quite a powerful mix, you know. So I think that's the message: is find what you like, and within what you like, find what you're good at, you know, and then off you go. Yeah. Does that roughly answer that? Yeah. Very good. You've always got questions.
I think a good one. It obviously takes a lot of work.
Yeah. But you know that's true.
Yeah.
But that's fine. I mean,
so when you start to play a new piece,
yes.
What's the first thing that you approach on it?
Well, if someone sends a new score,
how do you actually
sketch
get your head around it?
Well, it's interesting because I can tell you an exact story about that, which is I was in touch with a composer in Denmark, I think he's from. Anyway, I heard a piece and I thought that's really cool. I'd like to play that. So I wrote it, can I have the score? I'm looking for a piece, and they sent me the score. And it's a microtonal thing, like lots of these, you know, really funny tuning. And so then you sort of got to get into it. And I think the first thing, if there's no reference, if it's brand new, there's no recording, no one's played it before, all this stuff. I think the first thing is not necessarily to, go straight away, get the guitar and try to do something, but to look and read. Composers put this stuff, read the instructions. They put all this stuff in scores, like this Christmas trees, all this, right? And people, they get the score, and they never played it before, and maybe it's been written for them, and no one's ever played it, and the composer's written all this, and they go like this. Right, and then they get it, and they understand nothing, Or maybe they understand something, but they get it wrong, and it's in there, And so the first thing, I think, is to just sit down, and try to read the instructions first, and then try to understand, what's going on. Try to get inside it, understand what it's about. And then, what I'm always saying is, you take like 2 bars or something, and try to make the sound of what you understood to be inside the music. And then you sort of extrapolate from that and grow it organically. But I think, although it's very, very exciting, you get a new score and go, I get a guitar, I've got to go. But you have to resist that a little bit, and get excited about understanding the message of the music first. Otherwise, you're going to wander up many hundreds of blind alleys, and make what's maybe a 3-month process into a 3-year process to actually understand what's going on. Yeah, I think that's probably the first way. And then you have to go. Fingerings, really important. And then start planning fingerings. Because, fingerings, I didn't say this, but fingerings are part of the musical idea. And so if you get bad fingering, the phrasing is never going to be right, or the dynamics are never going to be right, or whatever. But you can't start planning fingerings until you understand what the message of the music is, until you understand the gesture. Because otherwise you're going to plan a fingering that is maybe physically not going to let you communicate what the music is about. I think that's probably a really good, way. Like with tonal music, it's maybe not easier, but it's maybe more preferred what the music is doing. Like, but you can feel a low boss first prelude. But when you think about that tune. It's much better there, isn't it? And so, how nice. But and so, but you can't plan that fingering until you understand that that's what the music is doing. But you only need to play that piece once to understand that you've maybe got a bad fingering or something. But if it's something like this, you could spend years playing it and not get the message, not get the idea. So I think that's very important. It's a very good question. And I think a lot of people, if they want to get into new music, that they maybe go off track right there, you know, as an instrumentalist. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think so. Mike?
It's probably very stupid. I listen so much that my voice is gone. It's really a silly question, maybe, but how can you hear a sound or a pitch in a 31 cents, flatter, sharper? I would find that really hard. I mean, it's in relationship with the other notes.
I think and that's the key, is the colour of the relationship with other notes. That, you know, you hear that, you know, the first one, that was a bit too much. That was a note sort of 41. You know, or something.
Yeah.
You know, that the relationship between the equal tempo, the normal one, and the other one. You know, if you played a note out of nowhere, you know, then, or if you played a sine wave, or something like that, I couldn't say, oh, it's, you know, I don't have perfect pitch or anything like that. You know, you just get used to the colour of the relationships between the interval. It's basically interval
It's like learning by heart.
Yeah, exactly. You know, but if you just played it out of nowhere, on a different instrument or something. But if it was on the guitar, I could probably tell you, because the colour, you know, those is so different that, you know, I can tell you what, you know, that by ear, obviously. But no, so it's about the colour of the relationships. It's a set of, it's defining a set of intervals, you know, like a chord. You know, that has a certain set of relationships. Like, you know, that's a major chord, you know, and so, but, you know, we know that's a seventh partial, that's 31 cents. You know, that's sort of, like that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Yes, absolutely, yes, indeed.
Anybody who hasn't got Refracted Resonance, at a knockdown price, it's worth every penny.
Indeed. Thank you very much.